Greetings and welcome to the Indian Debating League. My name is Pranay Rajbhala, and today I am proud to invite and welcome Ryan to this podcast. The podcast, of course, is called The Circle of Champions, and Ryan himself is definitely one of them. To introduce him, Ryan is a junior at Dartmouth College, double majoring in applied mathematics and political science with a keen academic focus on international security, conflict, and war. An exceptional university debater, Ryan has made a remarkable mark on the global stage, winning the World's University Debating Championship as second best speaker, clinching victory at the North American University Debating Championship, and earning the prestigious title of Speaker of the Year on the American Parliamentary Debate Association circuit. He also topped the speaker tab and broke first at North AMS, the premier US-Canada Debate Championship. Ryan's debating journey began in high school in the US, where he faced early setbacks, including not making the national team. However, during the pandemic, he doubled down on his passion and growth, honing his craft with unmatched discipline. Since starting university in 2022, he has remained deeply committed to competitive debating, writing over 2,300 pages of detailed notes or matter files to prepare for rounds, often dedicating 20 to 25 hours weekly in the lead up to major tournaments. I personally saw one of those files being used in a debate yesterday in Cambridge, so I can tell you the impact is being felt. Known for his sharp analysis and nuanced arguments, Ryan is particularly passionate about debating topics related to feminism, international relations, finance, and war. Perhaps most impressively, Ryan achieved all of this without the help of a university debating coach, cementing his reputation as a self-taught, fiercely driven, and intellectually curious debater. With that, I welcome you, Ryan. I think my first question for you is, we know all your achievements, right? And there's a lot of lore around this, I would say. But I would like to know, who are you, even apart from debating?
For sure. So first and foremost, thank you for having me on. Very much excited for this conversation. I'm sure we'll have a great time. So in terms of who I am, I think the thing that I would define myself as is mostly an interested person. A lot of people describe themselves as interesting people. Hopefully I'm interesting as well. But I think more than anything else, I'm an interested person, by which I mean I'm just interested in, I guess the cliche thing would be I'm interested in the world, but I suppose more broadly, I'm just interested in acquiring information and learning. And that obviously does sound a bit cliche or perhaps a bit nerdy, but I do think that there is something very meaningful and very valuable about learning about the world that we live in, not even just for the sake of winning debate rounds or applying arguments to speeches or whatnot, but I think that there is a tremendous joy and sort of meaning that comes from immersing yourself in figuring out why things are the way they are, why the world looks the way it does, how elections work, how economies work, and just understanding that at a somewhat deep level. And so I think for me, the sort of simplest way I would define myself is I'm an interested person, and debate has sort of extended or derived from my interest in the world.
I think that makes complete sense. And I won't waste any time before asking you the question which has been on my mind. Personally, I've been thinking about this for a long time now. How does it feel to win worlds, right? I think that's the question everybody wants to know about. So, especially considering the fact I think you're the first US team in the last 7 years. And yeah, I would love to know from you.
Yeah, it was thrilling. It still very much is surreal. It's sometimes hard to believe it, in part because debate is almost always a journey. And I keep using a lot of cliches, gosh, but what I mean by that is the way that you prepare, or at least the way that I prepare for debate, is very much focused on building up to tournaments and building up to rounds. So reading, sparring, giving practice speeches, etc. And so the vast majority of the time that I've spent in debate hasn't been in final rounds or in award ceremonies or waiting anxiously to hear whether or not you've won a debate. It's actually preparing for all of that. And so perhaps the thing that's most surreal about winning worlds is it's kind of like you've reached the mountaintop, so to speak. Like you've kind of finally accomplished the thing that so many people have hoped to accomplish or dreamed of accomplishing. Something I literally never thought I would have. My dream was always to make quarters at Worlds. That was always my goal in high school. My dream was I'll be in quarterfinals at Worlds and hopefully I won't make a complete fool of myself. And then fortunately I accomplished that at Vietnam. And so by that point I was kind of happy with whatever came next, regardless of winning or losing. So I think the thing that's kind of most surreal about winning Worlds, besides the fact that it happened and I never thought it did, is that you kind of spend the vast majority of your time like just going up the mountain, and then you kind of finally get to the top of the mountain, so to speak. And it's like, wow, we're here. So it's a very thrilling experience. There's not a great way to describe it in words. I think it's more of just a kind of surreal emotion. But it was certainly thrilling to win and pretty remarkable. I had literally no idea. The first time I ever thought about the idea of being a world debate champion was when they announced that we won. Like during break night, for example, a debater who I debated against at Worlds had come up to me and was like, "Oh, like, will you come back to Worlds next year if you don't win this year?" And I was flabbergasted at the idea that someone could even think that we would win Panama Worlds. I was like, "There's no way. This certainly won't happen. Like, obviously, we'll be back next year. Like, of course. Like, what do you mean we're going to win this year?" So it was pretty crazy that it happened. I very much didn't think that we would win. I didn't come into Panama thinking that we would win. I didn't come into finals thinking that we would win. I didn't even come into the awards ceremony thinking that we would win, but it was pretty cool for it to happen.
Oh, it's quite interesting. So I think related question I have. So when we kind of, compartmentalize our student, we look at three things, correct? So one are knowledge seekers. One is like a most bigger audience in entertainment seekers, correct? People who spend time searching social media, YouTube, TikTok, and all. So 70% just consume the content. B are knowledge seeker, knowledge in terms of really don't understand the world. It's just not specific entertainment content. And then 10% sort of people are really into highly competitive stuff. Whether in business they want to reach the pinnacle, whether it's sports, correct? Here the idea is not to understand the world, but to just game the world and be at the top. Being the world champion, is it like a mix of both? Or you still believe knowledge seeking, understanding the world was the major priority over winning the worlds while preparing last 10 years? Sorry,
this is a great question. So at least for me, my investment in debate is very divorced or separate from winning. And what I mean by that is some of the rounds I've had that I've had by far the most fun in are rounds I've either not won or were not competitively significant, in the sense that if you ask me to rank, like, what are your top 5 or top 10 favorite debate rounds that you've been in or speeches that you've given, I don't even think that my World's Finals round would be top 15 or top 20. So for me, at least, there is obviously a lot of value and kind of fun in winning and having competitive success. But I think that the more deep intellectual aspect of debate, at least for me, is why I do the activity and why I find a lot of value in the activity. Obviously, focusing on competitive success is perhaps a useful proxy for guiding your knowledge seeking, by which I mean there are certain topics, for example, or certain types of knowledge that you can pursue that are probably more closely aligned with winning debate rounds. Like, for example, you could become genius in a STEM field, and sadly, it probably won't end up winning you that many debate rounds unless you can find a way to succinctly summarize a mechanical engineering degree into a 7-minute debate speech, which would probably be quite an impressive feat. But I think that there is certainly some combination of competitive focus and sort of knowledge accumulation. The way that I personally think about like my relationship between focusing on winning in debate and acquiring knowledge is it's almost kind of like you build a knowledge base and then you sort of map that knowledge base onto the worlds that you build in debate. So what I sort of mean by that is you sort of have this abstract collection of things you know about facts, names, proper nouns, dates, events, stories, narratives, etc. And then that's what you then build your competitively winning arguments or extensions or strategies from. And so I think to some extent there is a mix between accumulating or pursuing knowledge and winning or being competitively successful. But they're at the same time very much distinct things. There are plenty of genius, smart people who don't win in debates, and there are plenty of people who win in debates that don't have my philosophy for how to approach debate, in the sense that some people perhaps deprioritize the focus on learning about the world and still find competitive success.
Yeah, no, interesting. So I think, look, it's very much aligned also how the, curriculums are designed in schools. So correct. So one group of thinkers thought that, look, and especially the priors, when we talk about, say, Indian boards, is that you have limited knowledge, or maybe you have some important knowledge that you really need to grasp. And correct, that's why there is a taught learning, rote learning in schools, correct, that you need to learn this stuff. And then there is a new kind of IB boards and all, which focus on much more in inquiry. The idea is that, look, the knowledge itself is vast. You can't cover all knowledge. Is that you need to know as much as possible, but ultimately you draw the connections and kind of building the semantics on top of that. That's the only way to survive, because more and more information will keep adding to the system, correct? Ultimately, how you draw and create that compelling argument, or in other cases, the compelling use case for whatever you are trying to do. Now, if Pranay has a question, I have one more question. So you started debating in schools, correct? But I
Yes.
believe that BP and WSDC are not really prevalent format in the schools debate in the US, correct? You have NSDA, you have Public Forum, Lincoln Douglas, which are really great in them, flow-based debating, but it's kind of different from what happens in the world. How come you become interested into BP? What was the journey in your school days look like?
Yeah, the American circuit is very, very different than the university circuit in terms of style. There are lots of memes. If you just Google like policy debate nuclear war memes, you'll get probably 10 bazillion results on Google because there's a whole bunch of memes about American high school debate as being a very specific type of debating that rewards arguments that would just objectively miserably fail in world schools or in BP. So for example, there are formats in American high school where like if one team has an argument that is about nuclear war, then the entire debate becomes about nuclear war. And the topic might be about, I don't know, corn subsidies. And somehow someone finds a way to make the debate about nuclear war. And then the entire debate's about nuclear war. Obviously, if you stood up in a world school speech in Prop 1 and said, panel, this debate about feminist advocacy will result in nuclear proliferation for the following 19 reasons, you would probably be laughed out of the room. So I did a sort of weird variant of world schools in my school's career. It was sort of a weird combination of world schools combined with a couple of other aspects of American high school debate. It was kind of like a bastardization of different formats. The reason that I was more interested in the sort of world schools slash BP slash extemporaneous styles as opposed to the more prep ahead styles, which is to some extent ironic given that I'm probably one of the more prep heavy debaters in the sense that my approach to debate is very heavily focused on learning about random things in the world and then applying that to debate, which is perhaps more closely aligned with the format where you are just reading evidence or researching a topic in advance. But I think part of it is there is just something very neat about debating a different topic every round. It's something that I don't think you appreciate until you don't have it, by which I mean if you've only ever done world schools or BP, you take it for granted, you go to a tournament, round one is this topic, round two is that topic, and so on and so forth. And it's very normal because that's what you're accustomed to and that's what you're habituated to. But if you're not used to that, there is something very cool about going into a tournament and saying, I'm going to debate 6, 7, or 8 different topics, and I will discuss them each for an hour and then move on. And by the end of this weekend, I will have learned something about 5 or 6 different things or concepts or topics. And that doesn't happen as much in formats, particularly in American high school debate, where you might have one topic for 2 months or one topic for the entire year. And that's not necessarily bad. There's value in depth in taking one topic and exploring it very thoroughly. But having a range of topics gives you a much broader understanding, I think, both of how to debate, because you're not just repeatedly talking about one thing. And it's also more interesting. Like if there's one topic, for example, in American high school debate that you're supposed to debate for 4 months, and you just hate the topic, it's a little hard to stay attached to that. It's much more interesting if, yeah, you're going to have some world schools motions that you hate and you think are boring and you think are really weighted. But then the next round, you could get a really cool, interesting motion about something that is very meaningful to you or something you're very passionate about. I think that adds a lot of depth to the activity in terms of how you relate to debate and how you find meaning in the activity. So that's probably the simplest reason I am more attracted to extemporaneous formats like BP or world schools.
No, yeah, that's true. Look, so I think I don't know if no Pranay. So Pranay debated. Actually, Pranay was a debater with us. A few years back, 3 years back precisely. He's like currently a lawyer, third year in UK. So when we started with WSDC and BP doing in India, correct? We were not aware PF and all. Is that obviously student across the world want to pursue what happens in US, correct? That's like a gold mark for at least a higher education, correct? And a lot of students look what the Stanford does in their tournaments, what the Harvard does in their forensics. And a lot of students apply. They look, we want to do PF. Don't you do PF? We said, okay, let's do that PF. And then we get to know, oh, so one tournament for the whole tournament. And whether out round, in round, you're going to just run that case. And we say, look, it doesn't get boring, especially for the judges and the student both, because ultimately you are just extending the case. So I guess that's quite unique, but obviously like different part helps and all. Now coming to, so A, just for the context, so we have also I don't know who was the coach during your selection time, but for the recent coach, Aditya Dhar. Aditya is the current coach of Team USA, also the winning team 2 years back. The first Team USA in the last 20 years, especially in the school space. And it's coincidence that the schools after preceded the so who was your coach, if you know, and how was your selection process look like during that time? Is it like a debate tournament comes and who wins that gets selected? Do they do some kind of camp? How is the selection process in US, especially during your time?
So I'm not sure what the selection process looks like these days, although I think it's somewhat similar. So the selection process back when I was in high school was a sort of series of steps. I think it was like a 4-step process where you would submit an online application, you would submit a video, for example, with an example of your debating. You would eventually progress to, I think they would do live rounds virtually over Zoom. This was pre-pandemic, admittedly, so this was back when it wasn't yet cool to do Zoom debate. I was quite bad in high school, quite objectively. And I don't mean that in like a humble way, like, oh, I was decent, but yeah, I just don't like I was really, really bad in high school. I looked at some of my flows from or like notes from high school a couple of days ago, just for fun. Like I opened up my 2018 like debate folder, which admittedly is not very deep compared to my current debate folders. But like, gosh, those if I judged a debater who said the things I was saying back in 2018, I would be outraged and think, how on earth is this person doing debate this well? So I was not particularly great in high school, even my senior year when I got more invested in the activity. So I never made it very far in the selection process. I will say that the fact that the U.S. has since turned around its World Schools program or become more competitively successful is quite remarkable. Aditya is an exceptional debater and obviously an exceptional coach, in part because the U.S. does have such a non-World Schools oriented school circuit. So to make the transition from public forum or Lincoln Douglas or policy or any number of other miscellaneous formats, there are a lot of acronyms in American high school debate, you might notice. If you ever look at one of our tabs, there's like 14 different acronyms that you have to look up what they stand for. It is pretty remarkable that the US has since pivoted and adjusted from those other formats towards being internationally successful in world schools.
Two questions. So I will come to the Pranay, correct? Pranay has also a lot of questions. So is that A, does this change as a reflection of the multipolar world that we are seeing? Correct? Like purely US centered, correct, doing things internally. Now they're also looking externally what's happening and try to kind of bridge. That's one question. The second is that, I guess this is a podcast in structural reasoning, correct? That's run by Nikki and all. There's a question asked to Ashish Kumar, correct? Ashish Kumar is like one of the also good, very known debater. Is that, especially there was no WUDC team winning from US in the last 7 years, but more specifically, even prior to that, the teams who were winning, they were mostly say, students coming from different part of the world and being at Harvard and other universities. So the students, you say, done schooling irrespective of where they were from, correct? Or the descendants, but that essentially students who done schooling in US never kind of, at least in the last 10-15 years, have been to the, say, majors of the world. And you kind of broke the expectation. Obviously, your teammate is from Hong Kong, which we done the recent podcast. What about that? Both the questions.
Yes, so I'll give two answers. One of them is a boring answer, and one of them is a much spicier answer, but I think it's the answer I agree with much more. So the boring answer for why the US has at points been successful, especially at the university level, I do think it's almost entirely attributable to having international students debate at US universities. Even if you think more recently, for example, about the most recently successful American universities at the international level, it's almost always students who grew up and debated in a non-American circuit. And there are obviously outliers. I'm one of them, for example, Devesh Kudnani, who debated in the US semifinal back in 2022. So there are plenty of outliers and exceptions, but there very much is a funny trend of people coming from, say, the Indian debate circuit, think Tejas, or the Hong Kong circuit, think XK, and then coming to universities like Stanford or Princeton and then doing very, very well. And so it's very funny because there is some North American nationalism, so to speak, within the North American debate circuit, like, North America, rah, rah. But it's very funny because it's really not North America or the United States doing well at these tournaments. It's the United States universities poaching talent from around the world, and then those debaters doing very well representing American universities. So I fully agree with you that there's an interesting trend there. So I think in terms of why American debaters specifically perhaps are less successful than you might expect internationally, there's probably two reasons. One of them is what I mentioned earlier. There's just, if you come from a format that looks completely disanalogous to BP or APTA or World Schools, it's very hard to make the transition successfully. There are people who make it, it's just hard. I think that the more controversial reason I'll give is so there was back in December, Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a kind of somewhat crazy, I guess he's not really that far right, but he's a right-wing politician in the US. He ran for the Republican nomination, whatever. He put out a pretty controversial tweet that got a bunch of angry people, both on the left and on the right, which is impressive. It's really impressive to tweet something that both the MAGAers and the Democrats hate. But the tweet was basically him advocating for the U.S. to expand H-1B visas, i.e., allow more, especially Indian immigrants into the United States, but more broadly allow more talented workers from outside the U.S. into the U.S. And the reason he gave, and I actually think that there is some truth to this, is basically the U.S. over obsesses or over glorifies mediocrity. And what I mean by that is there are a bunch of people who might have the talent or the intelligence in American schools or universities to do very well, but just don't apply themselves nearly to the extent that they would. And there are plenty of people who take less for granted and just work way, way harder. And as a consequence, are more successful students at universities, more successful debaters, and so on and so forth. So obviously, it would be a very crass overgeneralization to say that America is filled with like lazy, people who just need to work harder, etc. But I do think that there is, to a very significant extent, a correlation between the North American circuit and just not working nearly as hard as other circuits do. And it's still, to some extent, sad that you have lots of debaters internationally who work probably 3 or 4 times as hard as plenty of debaters who go to more prestigious universities but do less well. And that probably does reflect broader injustices or disparities in the debating world that have lots to do with income and access to tournaments and visas and all of that. But I do think that to some extent, probably the biggest barrier to the US debate circuit getting good internationally is like you just need to be able to grind or be willing to kind of just like do a lot of time at task. And perhaps that's less common in the American circuit than it is elsewhere. And that's probably a cancelable take for whatever it's worth. Like I'm not endorsing Vivek Ramaswamy. He's got some real deranged takes out there, and Trump is kind of a madman. But I think that there is probably some truth to that the US would be better at debating if US debaters had perhaps identical work ethics as debaters who are very successful from other circuits.
Oh, interesting. I think on the question, so it was not primarily meant that, US debaters are not good in schools. It was more not just about US, it's also equally about, say, UK, correct? Look at Oxford, who has been in the, other than Australia, correct? Australia has a lot of, especially University of Sydney, all their Australian debaters, but UK, US primarily have a lot of students coming from outside and taking over the debates, and started with Bosio, correct? Bosio was from Australia. Then it is 2018, even Dhruva, though reached to the semi-final and also the, say final, and then Tejas, obviously ISDS, and even his partner was from Bangladesh, correct? So the prior one. So it's there. Pranay, you want to take a question?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. Absolutely. I think firstly, so far I've just been listening in awe, sitting back and sort of hearing about these journeys and different structures across countries. I would love to know from you about like when exactly did you start debating though? Like a lot of people have different answers for this. Some people say they started debating way before they even got to a formal format of debating, right? Informally within their friends, and then it went up. So I'd love to know when you started debating and how have you kept yourself going till now, particularly because it must have been years now.
Yeah, so I started debating functionally back in high school. And I'm trying to think about, I'm trying to do the mental math to figure out the year. Probably 2017, 2018, I guess somewhere in that ballpark roughly. So I've been debating for a decent bit of time, and I've obviously had ebbs and flows in the sense of there are some periods in time where you debate a ton, you prep a ton, you read a ton, you do a bunch of practice rounds, a bunch of tournaments, and some times where you do very little and you don't stay that attached to debate. So that's very much applied to me. So I think that probably the biggest thing that's kept me in debate is sort of two things. I think the first, and this will be a cliche answer, so I wish I had something more original to say, but I do think that just having friends in the debate circuit is probably the best way to stay attached to the activity. So inevitably, it's hard to stay attached to debate if your only goal is winning or your primary goal is winning. And the reason why is just debate is a zero-sum activity. Someone has to win, someone has to lose, and there are more losers than there are winners. There will be one world champion, and that's it in any given year. There won't be two, there won't be five, there won't be 18. There's one. And so to that extent, if your attachment to debate is like, I want to do this activity because I like the thrill of winning, it's just going to be hard to stay attached. You're going to lose tournaments, you're going to take fourths, you're going to get a couple of calls from judges that you think are weird, and that's inevitable. So I think the easiest way to get through all of it is just to have friends. For me, it's been a bunch of people in high school and university who I think are wonderful people and fantastic friends and exceptional people, not just necessarily exceptional debaters. And there's a misconception sometimes that like top debaters have to be friends with other top debaters and not top debaters have to be friends with not top debaters. This is crazy. Like if you are a relatively new debater, there's no reason why you can't be friends with the world champion or why you can't have a good social relationship with people who are consistently in top rooms and vice versa. I think that there are wonderful people at all layers of the competitive chain. So I think that the first way that I've stayed attached is just having friends and people to talk with at tournaments and to chat about, not even just debate with, just like random stuff, or after a round you come out and you make a bunch of jokes because someone says something funny, and it's the easiest way to stay attached to the activity, regardless of how you're doing, regardless of whether you're winning or losing. I think the second way that I've personally stayed attached to debate is perhaps a little bit unusual, but for me, I think one of the things that I almost always do that I don't think many other debaters do is after tournaments, I'll almost always try to find at least one source or article or book or something about something that I've debated that someone has written from like a firsthand account. So what I mean by that is most people will read second source accounts about whatever they're debating. So for example, if you're debating economics, you'll read an economics textbook. If you're debating IR, you'll read a news article in the New York Times. If you're debating feminism, you'll read a Wikipedia entry or a various feminist blog, for example, on feminist theory. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is great. I think one of the things, though, that makes debate much easier to stay connected to is to think about why these topics matter to people in the real world, and finding some source or blog or YouTube video, although perhaps that's a little bit harder to find, of just someone who's directly connected to a topic and why they care about it or why they feel a certain way about it. So like, for example, I think the easiest way to get invested in international relations, which is probably a hard thing to get interested in if you're not naturally interested in IR. It's hard to wake up one morning and be like, I would like to learn everything there is to know about Southeast Asian politics. It's just hard to get invested in that unless you're already invested in it. But if you can think about it less as these are countries that have governments and elections and wars and economies, and if you instead think about it as there are people who are risking their lives to protest for a cause they believe in, and here's a video interview with one of them and why they feel strongly about this, or here's the petition that this group has signed, or here are the people that feel very strongly about these topics, I think it's much easier to find those topics interesting and valuable. So like, for example, I'll take a boring example, but suppose you have a debate about housing policy, not exactly the most thrilling thing ever. If you like read, for example, or learn about like books or articles, there's a great book, for example, a few years back that was written by an academic who basically just lived for, I think it was 2-ish years, lived basically with a group of people who were homeless. And basically just for like 2 years, he wrote about his experiences, what he saw, their struggles, etc. It's way easier to come into a debate about housing policy and be like, this is a topic that matters very deeply to someone out there in the world. And this topic will meaningfully affect their life and how they live and what they're doing tomorrow and whether they can eat and whether they have a roof over their head. And so if you can get emotionally invested in topics, I think it's much easier to stay attached to the activity, especially because people now myself included, have some topics they're more interested in than others. Like you might be really interested in debates about music and art, but hate debates about economics, or you might really like debates about economics and think that debates about art are stupid and silly. Inevitably, it's going to be hard to connect with some topics. And so the more that you can do to make yourself feel like topics matter, I think the easier it'll be to go into a round and think, this is an interesting debate. We're going to spend an hour talking about something that matters to real people. So I think that's one of the things I've done that has helped me stay attached to the activity for so long, which is to sort of think about topics not as abstract sort of issues you might read about in a academic journal, and instead think about them more as like, this is a topic that matters very deeply to someone out there, and we get to spend an hour of our lives talking about what we should do that best maximizes this person's outcomes.
I think that not only makes sense, but it sort of comprises the whole thing of a sense of belonging, perhaps, because there's community involved over there in both sides. One is community gets you attached to debating, but also if you understand every topic belongs to somebody or gives somebody a sense of belonging or takes away, perhaps it keeps you attached. So I would like to know, how do you perhaps foster such a community in Dartmouth? Is debating popular in Dartmouth? Is it something which is other things you do to perhaps get more novice debaters involved and start that ranking? I would love to know that.
Yeah, and before that, I guess a similar on basic question to that is that, look, so I believe did you had any idea that will you be pursuing debating in your college? B, if you are clear, then does that has any sort of correlation with picking that college, or is it just totally random? You say, so irrespective of which college I go, I will just figure out a society and I will work with them.
So I wish I could say like, oh, I really meticulously picked universities based on debate. In the end, Dartmouth just gave me the most financial aid, and I was like, all right, we're going to take that because that's money is great. I think that in terms of the Dartmouth community more specifically, the team is wonderful. It's a wonderful, wonderful group of people, and I really mean that. Like, obviously, everyone thinks that their debate society is great, right? Or most people do, at least. Like, everyone has friends, and everyone thinks that their friends are like
can't
the
really say it
best
loud,
debate
even
friends.
if it's not the best. You can't really say it loud, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like everyone is like, like everyone's like, the people that I spend my time with are the best debaters in the world, or the best friends to have on the circuit. But it is a wonderful group. Part of it is Dartmouth's team is growing. It's certainly not large, in part because the debate sort of interest is not enormously high. Perhaps that'll increase over time. I think that there is, to some extent, a virtuous cycle of when the team starts getting better or shows that it's competitively successful, other people suddenly think it's perhaps a more interesting activity that they might be willing to consider, even if they previously didn't. In part because some of the best debaters on our team are people who didn't have high school debate experience. So there are people who come onto the team, they've never done debate, they've heard of debate, the word, but they haven't heard of the rules of the format of the activity, and then do great. And I think that there is a very real advantage in some ways to being a debater who doesn't have a ton of debate background in schools or middle school, for example, because you come in with perhaps a fresh mind that's not been stained by the oddities of whatever previous format or previous norms that you're familiar with. But anyways, the actual community at Dartmouth is wonderful. It's a small team. It's growing. It'll hopefully continue to grow, but it's a wonderful group, and it'll hopefully continue to be that way, no doubt.
Okay. So look, so you, correct, was not such a great debater in your school days, correct? That's what you
Yeah.
correct? Not get selected to the team, and then you enter your college. I believe you start doing very well even from the first year, looking at your records, especially in the North American circuits. Now tell us, what does the transition look like? And this transition is important, A, to understand your journey, and B, to apply it to like a different circuit. So look at India. And I'm talking about here the university circuit, especially because in schools, we have ISDS, Indian School Debate Society. They do a wonderful job in selecting the team India, working with them. Tejas is their student, say 2018 and 19, through I was there. And there are obviously a lot of, so in school, at least I think India, at least at the WSDC, the best teams has a great exposure. They are at the best, obviously, extent of the student working hard. But at the university circuit, there's a lack, correct, as compared to other circuits. So let's just generalize the Asia. Obviously, Asia is a huge, continent, but there are only two continents, like, two countries specifically which have been. So one is Soradeep from Bangladesh, but again, I guess Soradeep has experience across the continent. So Bangladeshis goes to Australia and then come back to Bangladesh and then goes on to win the Worlds. And then obviously one is the David Africa, which is a brilliant example. Went to Worlds 3 times, correct, and finally win, which I guess Pranay just taken a interview few days. But to other countries, other than these, even reaching to the semi-finals and all, it's still a journey. Like for example, India is a huge country. I believe the same for China. That we as a country have never reached like in semi-finals of a Worlds seems like a bizarre. So I want to understand you from say not such a great debater, creating a community even in a college which relatively not they say dark horse in US debating circuit. How the transition look like? What are the learnings that someone else can apply, especially going to new circuits?
Yeah, for sure. So I will say that I think that transitioning to a new circuit or transitioning to a new style is hard at first, but will actually give you a surprising number of advantages in the long term. And I suppose what I mean by that is having familiarity with different circuits or formats or styles is actually a huge, huge boost, I think, if you can make the transition long term. Just like one example that comes to mind, like if you think about some of the teams that more recently, even from the US, have done really well at Worlds, like Helen and Ethan, for example, from U Chicago, have twice semifinaled, which is incredible. And I don't think either of them did all that much World School / BP in high school. I didn't do sort of that much BP / World Schools in high school either, and made the transition. Same as, well, I guess Tejas obviously has sort of the Indian background, or the Indian schools debating background, I mean, and made the transition to Uni BP as well. So I think there's a couple of pieces of advice I'd give for how to make that initial transition, which is sort of the hardest. If you can make the transition, you gain a lot from moving between circuits and formats. So I think the first thing is you should almost always enter knowing that you'll be bad at first and doing as much as you can from learning from people who are better than you. And I think that there's probably no better way to make an adjustment faster than just debating people who are much better than you and just getting demolished. And that's fine. Like, I think that there's a huge, huge benefit to doing debates or doing tournaments or practice rounds or even just spars within your own university or within your own debate society where you just get curb stomped. You come in, every single argument you made is torn to smithereens. You feel like you just gave the worst debate speech ever, and that's fine because the way that you learn is often through osmosis. So if you're making, if you're coming to a university and you're debating university for the first time, or you're trying to do debate for the first time, there's a lot of good that comes from losing, because you start to figure out what it is that makes a winning debater win, and what it means for a debater to lose a debate, or how they go about losing it. So I think the first thing, as weird as it sounds, is lose more and be okay with losing, because it sucks for that first month, 2 months, 3 months when you're trying to make the transition to a new circuit or university. But over time, you'll learn a lot more from people who are better than you than if you're doing fine as an intro level debater. Like counterintuitively, this is perhaps a weird thing to say, but in many ways, I actually almost wish that earlier in my debate career, I did have more losses that kind of stuck with me. And I absolutely did, just to be clear. Like, I lost a lot in my first couple months as a university debater. I had some rounds that, looking back, like, oh gosh, those speeches were not the speeches that I would say were my top ones. But I think that those types of losses stick with you in a good way. They make you a much better debater because you start to figure out why you lost and how you can improve. I think the second thing is just talking with other people about the transition and like what they're experiencing and what they're going through can be useful. Part of the issue with debate is that there is, to some extent, like a sort of positive selection effect in who talks publicly and loudly about their experiences with debate. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, I'll give an interview about winning world debate championships and my, career in debate and how I've approached it. But obviously, someone who goes, 1-4 at a tournament or struggles to make the break is naturally going to get less airtime. They're not going to get interviewed as much, etc. And it's tough then, because if you're trying to make the transition or trying to improve as a debater, if the only voices you're hearing are the winning voices, the people who are doing well and have figured out the art of debate, so to speak, it's somewhat easy at points to get advice that might not feel relevant to you or might not seem like it applies to where you're at with debate. So one of the simplest things to do, I think, whenever you're in any transition in your debate career is just to like talk with other people in similar positions. So if you're a first-year novice debater, like just talk with other first-year novice debaters about what parts of their transition they're finding the hardest, or what things have helped them the most, and have those conversations frequently, because this is perhaps the complement of my first piece of advice on losing to better debaters. You learn a lot from losing to better debaters, but you also gain a lot from discussing or talking or bonding with other people who are also in a similar boat as you. And to that extent, there's no shame in like talking about that and being honest, like, hey, this sucks. I don't know why I'm losing, or I don't know why this isn't clicking for me. And just talking about that, even with people who might not have the answers, like some people you might talk to who are also transitioning to university debate might not have like a magic golden silver bullet that will magically make you break at tournaments, for example, or help you figure out the norms of the new activity. But sometimes it's fine if you just talk with other people who are also not breaking to see what it is that they're struggling with. And you can typically get quite a lot out of that, I think.
And how does that look like for you? So, your college in a relatively remote corner, correct? And a small circuit. So was it like you going to external tournaments and figuring out like that these are the speakers that I really need to talk within this tournament, or irrespective of the tournament, I figure out that these are the, say, debaters across that I need to sort of intervene. So how that process look like, if not the names, uh,
Yeah, so in terms of what debaters you should learn from, one of the greatest gifts that came sort of luckily from the pandemic is a bunch of great recorded debates. There are so many excellent, and this still happens to some extent these days, but it just happens to a lesser extent because in-person recordings are just a bit harder than clicking record this meeting on Zoom. And one of the probably best ways to get, like one of the things that I did a bunch in my early days in university and my sort of late days in high school is just watching recorded debates. This admittedly is something that is probably a time inefficient way to get better debate, by which I mean, if your goal is I want to break at a tournament in 2 weekends, just cramming a bunch of YouTube videos into your brain won't make you break. But it is the thing that like long term, just watching debaters who are good at debate and just sort of soaking in their skills is great. And so one of the simplest ways I think for you to like learn some skills, even though you're not talking with debaters, so to speak, is watching recorded rounds. And there are so many, especially from that 2020 to 2022-ish, let's say, window, where you can find, 8 or 9 videos from really, really great tournaments that have the same debaters in multiple rounds. And you can watch them, learn from them, adapt for them, etc. It doesn't mean that you should pick up all of their mannerisms. Like one of the mistakes I made somewhat early on in my debate career was assuming that I just had to replicate what other very good debaters were doing. And that's fine as a sort of crutch to maybe marginally improve your debating by just saying, well, I need to debate more like this debater. But eventually you need to find your own approach to debate because you won't perfectly replicate what someone else is doing. And if you just try to perfectly replicate what someone else is doing, you'll always be a worse version of them. And you probably would just be better off making a better version of you. The second piece of advice in terms of how you find the people to talk to, I guess I'll actually have 2 here. One is probably the most boring, but if you're at in-person tournaments, like whenever you're waiting outside rooms, waiting for the oral adjudication or the result or whatever, you probably have, I guess in world schools, 5 to 6 other people right there, or in BP, 6, 7 other debaters who are just standing outside, milling around, waiting for results. Like talk with them. Like it's kind of easy to, at least in some circuits perhaps, or some tournaments to kind of like mill around or kind of not waste time, that's the wrong word for it, but not use that time to socialize with other debaters. Do it. I think it's a great way. Even if you don't talk about debate, just talking with people is how you make friends, and eventually those friendships pay off. In terms of the second piece of advice for figuring out what debaters you want to talk to actually learn advice from, the probably simplest metric is think about who's most effective at persuading you in your circuit, or who are the most successful debaters in your circuit. It can be intimidating to talk to really good debaters. Like I think especially if you're a schoolie, for example, like it's very easy to kind of hero worship or think of top debaters as these like kind of debate gods of sorts who are, insanely good and kind of operating on a different metaphysical realm of reality. And I used to think this, like when I was in high school, like I very much would think like, if this person is semifinaling or winning worlds, they are, like eating the food of gods. They're probably like spending 27 hours a day reading Wikipedia. Like they have everything sorted out. And then I won worlds, and then I realized that that cannot possibly be true because I know myself, and I know that if that's how even vaguely other really good debaters exist, like there's nothing supernatural about good debaters. They're people, they have lives. they have schoolwork, they have jobs, they have all the same things that everyone else struggles with. And so to that extent, like just talking with really good debaters is totally good. Like DM people and just ask if you have a question, like, hey, I want advice on this. Do you have thoughts? Probably 8 out of 10 times, really good debaters would be happy to respond. If there's one trait that's shared across good debaters, it's that they love talking about debate, regardless of who's asking them about it. But even just like talking with really good debaters elsewhere, like, I don't know, like, watching people's rounds and then asking, hey, how did you come up with your second extension? Like, what was your thought process there? People typically are more than happy to share this. I think that this is actually one of the, I guess earlier I kind of was a little overly harsh towards the American circuit. And I should clarify, the American circuit is wonderful. It has a bunch of really, really wonderful debaters. I suppose I'm not trying to say that American debaters are lazy. I suppose my point is that there are plenty of debaters who are really wonderful, smart people. And the way that really wonderful, smart people become really good debaters is by applying their skills to their work ethic and then putting that together to become a successful debater. But like even in the American circuit, I think this is something that the US circuit does actually quite well, which is like you'll just have huge group chats with a bunch of really top and really mediocre debaters who are still finding their way and still figuring out how to do well in the activity and just talking in there and like sending questions like, hey, here's a motion. What would you extend on closing opposition here? And almost always people have thoughts and almost always people who are way better than you will be happy to share. So I think in general, I suppose my general advice here is to trust that good debaters are almost always willing to talk, and it's fine to just talk with them.
Okay, related to it, so now you are, at least in the competitive debating, correct? Being the world champion is the biggest thing that you can achieve. Potentially, maybe you can go to the round robin. I guess you already gone to round robin, correct? Last year and all. You may be going to that. But other than that, what's next for you in terms of debating journey, correct? Because are you looking, I guess you're already coaching Team Mexico, but how does you're looking to go ahead with the debating,
So I'll certainly continue debating. Probably, obviously, it'll be perhaps a bit changed because now I've sort of accomplished the world's win. So mostly at this point, I'll be debating kind of for fun or for entertainment's sake. I think that like this is something that I actually genuinely had not thought about prior to Worlds, i.e., what I would do if I won. I will again emphasize I very much did not expect to win at Worlds. My goal was if we can make quarters or semis, that'll be nice at Panama. Hopefully we can match or come close to matching our Vietnam performance where we semied as well. So coming out of Worlds, my sort of thought was like, well, I don't exactly know what my debate future looks like. I think though that like at least for me, it'll probably be continuing to speak for the sake of speaking, not for the sake of winning. There's a lot of fun to be had in giving speeches where you're no longer that concerned about placing first and you're just happy to give a speech that is fun or is kind of cool. One of my favorite speeches that I've given recently, for example, was the Oxford IV final. Was a round where we ran an extension that was strictly losing. It was never going to win the debate. Although we did manage to somehow get 2 panelists to vote for us. So we snookered 2 of them into voting for us. But the extension that we ran was crazy, but it was very fun. The topic was basically whether or not a majority of people in the West will basically get into heaven, essentially, i.e., do a majority of people in the West live a sort of net morally good life? And the extension that we ran from closing opposition was we think God is evil and probably rewards people who are very bad. And so the way to get into heaven is to be a bad person. And so we agree with the 2 teams on government bench. Most people in the West are bad people. We think they're therefore going to get into heaven. And it was a pretty crazy argument, and there are lots of steps that weren't proven. But it's a fun case. It's a cool argument to run. It probably was never going to win. It shouldn't have won, and it didn't win. But those types of rounds are the rounds where if you're no longer as concerned with I really want to, I don't know, boost my speaking CV or win this tournament, etc. You can certainly have rounds like that. So I think that that'll probably be my future, i.e. still doing debate, mostly for the sake of having speeches like that are kind of meaningful and fun, but maybe not necessarily strategically optimal.
I think that's the one part that I really like about BP, especially the extension, correct? It makes you much more creative. Because if you don't have a closing half, it's become very, WSDC is great, say Asian Parliamentary on, but the BP extension really make you creative, especially if you have matter dumping teams and, very good teams at the opening part, how you come with creative, crazy argument, which you may not have come, correct? If you are in the opening part, correct? Especially the kind of cases that you mentioned. Now moving ahead, so you have your math, I'm just going to your current choices, correct? So you have maths as your majors along with political science, especially in the international affairs and all. So tell us about like, combination of maths plus political science, what your kind of interest lies.
So I will preface this by noting that I am really much worse at math than I am at political science. Again, this is not humility. This is kind of objectively like I'm a pretty mediocre maths student in university. I'm pretty solid at international relations. I'd happily go on for hours and hours talking about international politics and whatnot. But certainly math is not my strong suit. That being said, I think math is a fascinating field, and there are some really interesting parallels between math and debate. I actually think that for whatever it's worth, one of the activities that is most brutal in the sense that it takes forever, but can be really funny to do as a debater, is to try to make a debate argument like a math proof, by which I mean make the argument literally as formulaically as you can in every single link, no matter how small it is. Like even the ones that we almost never would seriously contest in debate, like companies are profit motivated, right? No one's ever going to, contest that seriously in debate. No one's going to be like, no, I think for-profit companies actually don't care about making profit. No one's going to say that realistically, but actually proving that, as you would have to prove in, say, a math proof, where something that's not immediately self-evidently true from definitions must be proven, can be a kind of fun activity. So I think for me, math is mostly an interesting activity and sort of almost puzzle solving, I think is the best way I could put it. Like math has some parallels to debate in the sense that you have a question you're trying to answer or prove or solve, and it's mostly just like what strategy or method do you use to approach it. So in the context of debate, that might mean how do we prove an impact happens? In math, it might be how do you prove a theorem is true? And so I think that's kind of where there are some interesting parallels. Political science is certainly the thing I'm personally more interested in. I think part of it is just like this is a pretty crazy time in the world, and I don't just mean Trump, although that certainly has made the statement more true. But like the world is probably in a very unique moment, and to the extent that you're interested in the world, there's probably not been a time as relevant as this one to think about what's going on in the world, not just in terms of like just the US, but even most theaters of the world, sub-Saharan Africa or the conflicts in the Congo or Sudan, Myanmar, you could go on forever and ever and ever. And so at least for me, international relations is probably my more like specialty of sorts, just because I think it's a relevant field at this moment in time.
Yeah, I think bunch of questions here. I think Pranay is still, I guess, catching cold and all. I think I'm like a math lover, correct? I cracked the Indian sort of entrance exam just because of the math. So here in India, there's an exam called IDJE, correct, where you go to these engineering colleges and you have math, physics, chemistry. But I just cracked just because of math, correct? I just left math, and I really relate the idea that math is essentially, I guess, the purest form of logic,
Yeah.
because here, even in political science or in the real world, there is the idea of persuasion, which is much more rhetoric. But in maths, is purely logical, one step by one step, correct? So that kind of relate. And obviously, I guess even last year, the team, Mark Anthony, correct, the partner of Aniket, was also a PhD in maths, and even David Africa is sort of. So yeah, so there are a lot of debaters. Obviously, there are a lot of debaters who do economics, then political science, but there are math lovers also in debating world. Now you talk about political science and what is happening around the world. So one of the comment, like I think I watched few of the world's videos, the final, semi-final definitely, but I guess the semi-final one, especially the intervention one, really come across how knowledgeable you are about what's happening in Africa, especially how much matter dumping and so much specifics, and it's kind of different style within your team, correct? Your partner Matlina, and giving so much details about that. Related to that semi-finals, before I go to other questions, like I really love how you flips the arguments, correct? What are your take? And I guess you kind of become aware that a lot of people take your example names and how to flip. Look at Rian's video of semi-final of WDC 25 semi-finals. I guess Tejas is also, but I guess I really want to understand, is there a specific focus that you do, or it just naturally become part in the last few years? How to flip the arguments? What are the way how you do it?
Yeah, so flipping is probably the most effective way to rebut an argument because it's the most likely way for you to win the debate through rebuttal. So what I mean by that is in any sport, I don't know if debate can be considered a sport. I'm kind of agnostic on the question, but if you assume debate is a sport for a moment, every sport has some offensive and some defensive part, right? Like you are trying to score on the other team and you're trying to prevent the other team from scoring on you. And most debates, like debate is an offense heavy game. And what I mean by that is you win debate by having more offense than the other side. So perhaps a little bit less technically to reframe that. You win the debate if your impact is more important or more significant or better developed than the other team's impact. The problem is that part of how you prove your impact is bigger than their impact is by downsizing or mitigating the other side's impact, right? Like they say they're going to deter crime or stop violence from happening, but actually they're not going to do it that much. The problem is that most rebuttal, like most ways of mitigating or attacking arguments, just limits the scale of impact that the other team can claim. So the other team says we have this big of an impact, it's actually this big. We're going to save 100 lives, your rebuttal says, no, you're going to save 20. And that's fine, but if debate is a weighing game, in any extemporaneous format, quantification is very hard. It's very difficult for you to say, we will reduce unemployment by 2.7%, and they will only reduce unemployment by 2.5%. Therefore, we win the debate because we have the bigger impact or whatever. It's very hard to do that in a format where you can't quantify your impacts. So to that extent, there is value in having defensive mitigation, or mitigatory defense is the better way of putting it, i.e. there is value in being like, they have an impact, but it's less big than they say it is, and therefore we can outweigh their downsized impact. But the more effective way to attack arguments typically is to just say, look, they might be right that their impact is important, or for example, in the Sudan debate, like I was trying to flip arguments about why violence would go down in Sudan if we sent an international peacekeeping force in. And in that context, you can only mitigate that argument so much. In other words, if the other team says, we should try to stop a genocide, it's kind of hard to be like, well, this is not that important because your impact isn't that big. So the better strategy typically is to try to find ways to get their impact better, or alternatively, in some cases, prove that their impact might actually be a bad thing. So in the Sudan debate, for example, it's obviously impossible to say their impact is a bad thing. If the government team that supports an intervention in Sudan stops a genocide in Darfur, pretty much Op can walk out of the round and say, congratulations, Gov wins. There's pretty much no way we're going to win this debate. So the better strategy is really to say, here are reasons why violence would actually get worse on their side. And what that allows you to hopefully do is to use rebuttal as not just a defensive strategy, like downsizing their impact, but to use rebuttal as an offensive strategy to generate impacts for your side, for the judge to say, well, maybe actually opening opposition has proven that violence is worse if we did an intervention, and therefore this is an argument we can credit to opening opposition. So that's like my theoretical justification for why flips matter, which mostly is it's hard to quantify mitigation, but it's more effective to say we actually get their impact better on our side. In terms of how to do flips, so admittedly, I think that there's two parts to flipping arguments, and people focus heavily on one and less on the other. So the part that everyone can sort of intuitively grasp for how to flip arguments is you're just trying to prove the converse or the inverse of whatever the other side's argument is. So in this sense, this is kind of just like argument generation. In other words, if the other team says, we will stop a recession, and you are trying to flip that argument, you're basically just trying to brainstorm arguments for why the other side would cause a recession. And so in that sense, rebuttal suddenly looks a lot similar or very similar to argument construction, i.e. if you're trying to flip an argument, you're just trying to come up with a reason why the inverse of their claim is true, which is basically just an exercise in case construction. The second part of flips, though, that is admittedly a little trickier is you need to make sure that your flip or whatever you're trying to flip actually responds to the other side's logic. And what I mean by this is a common trend you'll see in some debates, especially like sort of mid to upper middle level debates, i.e. debates where people are certainly really comfortable with the fundamentals and know what they're talking about, but still have room to improve, is a team will say an argument, another team will say, we're going to flip this argument, and then they just give a counter reason why some other thing will happen. And that's fine, but I don't know, simple example might be, let's say, this house would raise the minimum wage. An opening government says we should raise the minimum wage because this means that people will have more purchasing power because they'll have more money. They're going to have a bigger wage. An opening opposition says, actually, no, we're going to flip this argument. You're going to have less purchasing power because prices are going to go up. This is fine. Both arguments make sense. Opening government says you have bigger wage. Opening opposition says, but the prices will be higher. The problem is that you haven't really flipped the argument if you've just said the response about higher prices. You've just given a competing reason that runs in the opposite direction of opening government's reason. So if you're going to flip an argument, you don't just need to construct an argument for the inverse of their claim. You also need to figure out what the underlying reason for their claim is and make sure that your flip explains what's wrong with that. So I'll give a simple example from the Sudan round, which admittedly was a fun round. I'm still a little mad about it because the very opening line I misspoke. The very opening line is actually incorrect. I opened with some sentence about the SAF committed a genocide back in the early 2000s, which is true, but I misstate where the genocide happened, which has always bugged me a little bit. But anyways, in the Sudan round, for example, opening government, the team that we're debating against, gives a series of reasons why if we invade Sudan or put an interventionist peacekeeping force in Sudan, violence will go down, genocide will stop, etc. And the reason they give for this at its core is if we have a peacekeeping force in Sudan, the peacekeepers can basically stop violence from happening because no one will attack the peacekeepers. And if they do, the peacekeepers will just make sure that civilians don't get killed. And one of the sort of flips that I have to this argument, or one of the sort of flips I offer, is actually, UN peacekeepers will be targeted by paramilitary forces like the RSF in Sudan. And the reason why is that if you're a military force in Sudan, you know that eventually, if the UN suffers enough casualties, the UN is going to pull the plug on the operation. It's going to pull soldiers out because there's just not enough political will to sustain a really bloody intervention in Sudan. And that flip is maybe questionable whether or not it's true in the real world, though I suspect it probably is. But the reason why that flip is effective isn't just because it says violence gets worse, and the reason violence gets worse is because now you have a bunch of peacekeepers that get killed. The reason why the flip is useful is because it also attacks the underlying argument opening government has given in that debate for why intervention in Sudan would reduce violence, namely that peacekeepers will be effective at maintaining peace because their presence will deter violence, or their presence will incentivize rebel forces to not open fire. So if you can attack the premise of their argument and flip their argument in the process, because the premise is wrong, because the soldiers will incite violence, and therefore their impact is wrong because violence will go up, that's an effective way to flip an argument, because you're not just saying, here's a competing counter reason that is the inverse of what they said. You're hopefully giving a flip that both defeats their underlying logic and explains why some impact will occur in the inverse direction. How to do this? In the sense of, like, I don't know, if you're a schooly debater and you're like, how do I flip arguments? The simplest way to do this, or the simplest way to get better at doing this, is to do practice with long form rebuttal. And what I mean by that is people will spend a lot of time when they're prepping, like doing practice preps, right? So a common example of this that everyone's probably heard of is, oh, every day you should take a motion, prep it for 15 minutes, and give a prime minister speech, and you'll get better by doing that. And that's fair. But you can also do the rebuttal version of this activity, i.e., find either an online round that is recorded, or another way that you can find arguments you want to rebut. Open the opinion section of any major international newspaper and find some opinion article and figure out what its argument is. And then just write, like, open up a Google Doc or open up a sheet of paper and just write out as many responses as you can think of to it. Like, here are the 5, 6, 7, 8 different ways I would attack this argument. And if you can get really good at building like a sort of instinct for, here's how I can attack the premises of their arguments, or here's how I can flip their arguments, and you do this as a drill, as something you actually practice somewhat religiously, it becomes very easy in debates to start thinking about, as you are hearing arguments as they're being said, here's the obvious problem here, or here's the link in this argument that's most vulnerable to attack, and here's why I can flip. And what this drill is hoping to eventually accomplish is every argument is ultimately a series of links, right? A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, leads to impact. So in the Sudan debate, it's international peacekeeping force leads to deterrence, leads to less violence. The typically most effective way to rebut an argument is to figure out what the most contestable or most vulnerable link in the argument is and attack that link. So, for example, in the minimum wage debate, no one would attack the final step in the argument, which says increasing wages is good because poverty is bad. No one's really going to attack poverty is bad. That seems pretty uncontroversial. But the link that's really vulnerable to attack or to criticism is, if we raise the minimum wage, then wages will rise faster than prices increase. That's the link that you can exploit. And so the more practice you do with rebutting arguments and practicing this long form without being in a round or without having time on the clock, you get much better at figuring out what steps in the argument are vulnerable to attack, and how can I attack those arguments and sort of make the other team regret not proving that argument to completion.
Yeah. Understood. And I also want to know, you've mentioned dedicating extensive time to matter filing, for example. You've also right now spoken about, writing all these rebuttals to opinion articles online. I would love to know, in producing these 2,300 pages of notes, including which, like I saw yesterday in person, 500 pages of those, right? And I flipped through it and I was like, okay, I want one of these myself and I want to go through it myself. Uh, can you show your process of organizing and utilizing this information effectively, especially when you might be in a debate and you might want to find that one piece of page,
Yeah.
across 2,300 pages. Yeah.
So, at least for me, my goal is as rarely as possible to actually use my matter files in rounds. I've probably used it, if I had to guess, maybe 3-ish times, maybe 4. In rounds. And what I mean by 3 or 4 times is there are maybe 3 or 4 times where I've actually physically pulled out this huge stack of paper and like flipped through pages and been like, okay, here's the relevant page that I'm looking for. Here's what I'm going to say. And the reason I don't think it's very useful to do that, even if you are using your own matter file or someone else's matter file, is it's very rare to have one specific fact or claim or specific argument that completely change the debate. That's not entirely true. There are some debates where having specific knowledge is absolutely lethal if you know how to deploy it effectively. But more often than not, it's not worth your time to, furiously like flip through a bazillion pages and be like, where is that fact? I know it's there somewhere, but I just can't find it. Typically, your time is just better spent thinking and brainstorming arguments as you would normally. Not the least of which is because in some cases, you'll just get more bang for your buck spending 2 minutes brainstorming more arguments than trying to find one hyper-specific fact. So at least for me, the way that I think about matter filing and writing things out is just a way to build a knowledge base, and having the paper there is kind of a useful backup option in case you can't recall whatever you need to recall. But the aim is to build your own knowledge base internally so that even if, I don't know, you accidentally lost your matter file or you suddenly forgot how to read or, I don't know, any crazy scenario like that, you would still be fine. So at least for me, the aim is not to have a matter file, pull it out and say, aha, this motion is clearly written out on page 379. Opening opposition will be proven incorrect. The aim is to have knowledge that you can pull from organically. You don't need to have a perfect memory. I do not have a perfect memory. I recall very few hyper-specific facts that I've written. But the aim more so is if you matter file specifically, in other words, if you matter file a bunch of facts that are fairly specific, fairly minute, then most debates will not require hyper-specific facts. They'll just require general knowledge about what's going on in a country or a region or an election or an economy or a social movement. And if you have matter filed at the hyper-specific level and you only remember 2 or 3 stages of generality up from that, you'll probably be fine. So what I mean by that, for example, is I'll give a simple example, which is I did a lot of matter filing prior to Panama Worlds about Syria because the Assad regime had just fallen and there might have been a Syria motion. And I was very hyper-specific in matter filing Syria. So I assembled like mini biographies of all of the major leaders of every major rebel faction in Syria. I had a bunch of specific information about like the specific Russian military bases on the Western Syrian coast, stuff that if I said it in a debate round, people would say, oh, there's no way we can credit this information. It's wildly hyper-specific. Like the other one I remember doing this for was I was matter filing Russia-Ukraine in case Ukraine showed up. And there's actually, this is my publicly released matter file, but there's like a page in there where I list out the specific speed that a certain Russian missile can go. And there's just no way that would ever help you in a debate to say, well, opening opposition says this argument, but they're wrong because they don't remember that this missile actually travels at Mach 11, not Mach 9. So clearly they're wrong. But the idea is if you matter file at that level of specificity, or if you're taking notes at that level of specificity and paying attention at that level of specificity, then when you get a topic about Syria or about Ukraine, you don't need to remember the specific details about Russia's military bases in Latakia. You just need to remember Russia has a military presence in Syria and the Syrian government has just collapsed after a rebel offensive. And so even if you forget the details, if you can remember the story that those details contribute to, that's how you then use that information to win a debate round. And part of the reason for this is your judge will not, well, I guess in my case it's weird because I've open sourced my matter files, but your judge will not have your matter file, or the judge will not have your notes, or they probably won't have read the article you read. So if you just start saying specific facts from a foreign affairs article, and you're kind of like wink, wink, obviously we all know the foreign affairs article I'm referencing, so you should connect the dots for me. That doesn't happen. So you need to actually explain things to a judge as if they haven't heard these facts before. And so to that extent, it actually is good to not remember the hyper-specific details and instead just focus on painting a compelling picture for the judge under the assumption that they are not familiar with the hyper-specifics themselves. So for me, the aim, this is a long answer, but the short version of it is matter filing is good because it produces knowledge, which you can then tell at a non-hyper-specific level in a way that is useful for constructing more persuasive cases.
I see should I go ahead or do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, I have a question related to it. So, look, before the COVID, the online debating, especially on the Zoom, was relatively, scarce, correct? I don't think anyone was doing it, if someone maybe. But then you have COVID and you have online Zoom. Obviously, it's fade away, but still there are significant, at least the less resources or tournaments happening, or where, you want to run, say, pan India. Like India is a huge country, and to organize each and every tournament, which is you want to invite everyone, has become really challenging. And then obviously the problem with debating is that to run a big tournament, you require equal pan number of rooms as compared to say other activities. So that was the one transition. Now, do you see how the generative AI, especially we see more in the school circuits, correctly, a lot of students go ahead and say, oh, let's use generative AI. Let's just ask ChatGPT. Obviously, they're not the best resources that they create, but let's suppose eventually we have to mix debating with generative AI. How does that look like? So just before that, setting the context, so I'm an engineer, correct? So we are trying to build few use cases that mostly for the school debaters, which are beginner. Say one use case is surely that you have a debate. So if you're a beginner, correct, you can debate against AI, correct? So they can produce an argument, you can produce back and all of the things. Another is to have them as opponent, which is that, so one is as a practice, one is as equal opponent. And third, which maybe can be used, but not really tried, at least I've not seen it everywhere, is that they judge you, correct? So now the problem with debating, especially the practice, is that you need to find a good judge at your level, which can give you really good, feedback and all. These are three use cases that I see, could be one practice, one is an opponent, one is a judge. How you see could be the use of generative AI in debating, and does it help, or it gonna, kill the debating? What's your take on, this?
So I'm fairly opposed to any generative AI usage in competitive debating tournaments specifically, either as a competitor and certainly as a judge, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I do think that AI is a useful tool for practice and for improving. I just think that you should use it in the way that it's most likely to be effective in helping you improve. So, for example, ChatGPT will give you a lot of ideas, and it will give you a lot of potential arguments on the topic. But ChatGPT, even if you kind of fine-tuned it for debate, is almost never going to be familiar with the specific norms and sort of argumentative preferences of your circuit, of your format, of your judges, and so on and so forth. And what I mean by that is, if you give a motion, like I could give a motion to ChatGPT right now, and so I could give it the world's finals motion, and I could say, come up with, 7 arguments for Gov and 7 arguments for Op. And it can do that. And then I can say, explain each argument in 300 words, and it can do that. And it won't be terrible. Like ChatGPT will give you functional arguments that you could say verbatim in a debate round, or you could learn from in practice. There's, I think, a few issues, though, for why you shouldn't just blindly use AI as a way to practice. The first and the most obvious is hallucinations. AI will just lie to you and will give you terrible information. My experience personally is I think AI is a good practice tool to understand concepts, but very bad to understand facts. So what I mean by that is if you're trying to learn, something about financial assets or financial securities, you might benefit a lot from using AI to be like, hey, I'm trying to understand how a mortgage-backed security works. I'm going to tell you how I think a mortgage-backed security works or what the process looks like. Can you tell me where I've gone wrong or what I've missed or how my logic is incorrect? But if you try to ask ChatGPT, hey, can you give me specific information about, I don't know, the Argentinian feminist movement, good chance that whatever names it comes up with or dates that it spits out could plausibly be wrong. And so there's a risk in relying on it. The other thing that debate misaligns with AI on is just norms. So what I mean by that is if you watch a debate round and transcribe what is said and then compare what is said in a really high level debate round to what ChatGPT says, there are just small stylistic differences in how arguments are introduced and how arguments are explained, because debate just has some norms of what judges are expecting and what is considered adequate proof or what steps in an argument need to be proven very rigorously. Like a kind of example of this that I think shows up a decent bit is ChatGPT is really bad in my experience, or generative AI generally is really bad at any debate about morality or about philosophy, because AI will end up just kind of spitting out buzzwords at you that if you used in a debate round, a judge would be like, well, you've said the word autonomy 7,000 times, but you haven't made the argument for why autonomy matters or why it's useful. And so to that extent, AI is useful for giving you ideas, but you still need to be the person that turns abstract ideas or argument concepts into a well-mechanized, well-framed, well-impacted argument. And that's the thing that I think, as of today, AI is probably still relatively bad at, because it's the part of debate that remains probably the most human-centric or unique to humans. Like AI can give you a list of arguments, but it can't make those arguments as would be needed to be made or presented to get an 83 or an 84 in a BP round, or a 74, 75 in world schools. The third thing that I think AI is not great at for debate practice, or the thing that you should be cautious about whenever you're using AI, is there is a risk of what I'll sort of call moral hazarding. And what I mean by moral hazarding is it's very easy to get a topic you don't know much about, throw it into ChatGPT and say, give me arguments. And then ChatGPT gives you arguments and you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. This makes sense. Okay, I can see this argument. Oh, okay, this all works. The problem is if you can't use ChatGPT or AI at a tournament, if you can't understand the process by which you come up with arguments or the way you come up with argumentative ideas, it's a problem, because you might be able to explain an argument if you're given the tagline of the argument. But if you can't come up with the tagline in the first place, then relying on AI becomes very destructive. So, for example, let's say you are trying to learn how to debate about economics, and you don't really know how to come up with the right case lines or the right broad arguments. But if you're given a case line, you're like, oh, your partner says, okay, the argument that we should run is this policy is going to increase housing speculation. And you can say, oh, okay, that makes sense. I can come up with reasons for that, or I can figure out how to make the argument. That's fine, but it only works if you can come up with the argument tagline. And so the risk is if you become reliant on using AI, it detracts from your ability to think independently of AI. And so when you need to then be in a debate where you can't use ChatGPT to come up with case lines, there's a risk of being over-reliant. And when you're over-reliant on AI and AI is taken away, that creates problems. That being said, there's nothing wrong with using AI to prep as long as you use it smartly. By prep, to be clear, I don't mean prep like prep in tournaments. I mean prep in advance of tournaments. In terms of AI's use as a sort of direct opponent / as a judge, I think as an opponent, it actually can be kind of a good way to like figure out how arguments might potentially be responded to. So one of the things that I did at points is if I was trying to figure out how teams might respond to an argument I might make, this more applies to APTA. For reference, APTA is the university format in the United States where the government team basically sets the topic for each debate. And sometimes you want to see like, oh, I have a lot of thoughts on how I would opt this topic, but I'm curious how someone else would. And so sometimes you might be like, oh, what does ChatGPT think are the arguments against this topic or whatever? There's a lot of value in that, for example, in being like, oh, here's what the computer thinks, might be a viable op or set of op arguments. So I think as long as you're using AI smartly and you're cautious of its risks, it's fine. In terms of AI as a judge, I know eventually maybe we'll get there. My suspicion is that right now it would probably be a little tricky to do that without having huge problems. I also think, for what it's worth, that there is just a part of debate that should remain about persuasion, and persuasion in a way that is uniquely human. This is perhaps a bit anthropocentric because it's kind of a very amorphous, like abstract debate is about human persuasion. And this is a subjective opinion. People will disagree, and that's totally fine and totally reasonable. But what I mean by that is, like, debate probably shouldn't just be about maximizing for picking the objectively right winner based on the arguments that are made. Part of debate should also be about developing skills that are transferable outside of debate, in part because debate is cool and all, but also most people will finish debating in university with the exception of a couple of dinos, I guess. And debate will then just become something that they did in their life that will help them in other aspects of their life. And so I think one of the risks with not having a human be a judge is there just are parts of persuasion that probably aren't replicable by a machine. So for example, like even simple things like just explaining arguments in a way that is emotionally persuasive to judges. I don't just mean style or using big EPL words, but I mean like standing up or on Zoom, like just presenting an argument persuasively in a way that convinces the human judge sitting across from you that yeah, this argument is important or it matters. There is value in that, and AI might not be able to capture that to nearly the same extent. So I think, long story short, AI is probably bad for competitive purposes, but decent if used smartly for prep.
Right. I think we are running late on time. So I will ask one question, then we'll pass to Pranay. Correct. So I think you talked about earlier that we are at a pivotal point, and it from multiple point of view. Trump is a one, correct? One, you have a China rise, multipolar world, Africa, whole bunch of things. Then you have generative AI. One is where so we work in education, and I see there's a recent, report in FT, Financial Times, which is essentially that, not today. So from 2000, so there's an exam called PISA, correct? Which is primarily, they try to capture whole OECD countries and consider where in terms of reading, writing, and other skills. And not just, in last 5 years, from 2010, the average has plateaued, like the best average has plateaued. It's not increasing. So before that, for the last 30 years, by putting more and more resources, is Finland, Singapore and all, or the South Korea, the scores were increasing. Now they plateaued, and it kind of now looking to diminish. So obviously it's about rise with the internet, because generative AI just started like 2000, say 20, post-COVID, but the more internet was there. Now I believe that's a trend. Now, with what we just discussed, that leave aside how the competitive debating work, because that you can set up the rules and you can guide it, especially if it's in person, correct? Online is really hard to guardrail student using it. But in the general sense, correct, in the population, the students, college student will use generative AI. It's really difficult to stop, correct? Universities will try, but as you know, we know from plagiarism and all, it's really difficult to crack it. It's like a, police and thief situation. You try to create anti-ChatGPT solution to capture and all. But for the vast majority of the people which going to use ChatGPT, I believe they're going to miss the nuance. As you said, like, if you're going to rely on ChatGPT to create the headlines, the broad matter file, then maybe how the exact nuance working on that particular idea, you may not be able to come for majority of the things. And that's become a challenge in the world where majority of people rely on just broad headings. What's your take on that? Do you feel that's also pivotal in terms of how human cognition will evolve from here, as compared to obviously, political science, what is happening around the world, but how the human cognition in general will pivot from here with these kind of technologies and all?
For sure. So I think that there's a lot that remains to be seen about how humans interact with AI long term. This probably is a weird moment, and in the sense that we're sort of at this weird inflection point where AI seems to be progressing fairly rapidly, and people are using it, but it hasn't yet become systematized in the sense of like how AI will be used in the workforce or in education or even in debate, where there's a lot of ad hoc, like some debate tournaments will allow AI, some schools will ban AI, some workplaces will encourage the use of AI for assisting humans, some will replace humans wholesale. I think it remains to be seen like what the long-term effects are, but I think that it probably is the sort of thing that from the perspective of someone who's just thinking about the world is something that you should be cautious of yourself. And I suppose what I mean by that is like, if you're the average person in the world, if you're me, if you're a debater watching this, like you probably are not going to single-handedly change how, AI gets implemented or what effects it has on the human brain and on cognition and the labor force and all of that. But I think people should be conscious of like how their own use of AI affects themselves personally. I think that this is probably variable person by person, but it is very easy to get sucked into the trend of AI without thinking about the long-term effects that might have even on your own cognitive abilities or your own ability to think independently. The analogy I draw is there is a lot of increasing literature at the same time that there's now literature today on declining test scores. The other interesting branch of literature focused on the rise of technology is on changes in trends in youth happiness. So historically, there was a pretty ironclad relationship in what was called the U-shaped theory of happiness. The idea is that people were happy as kids, they kind of got like not so happy as like middle-aged adults, and then they got happy in their retirement because things started looking better. And now there's a lot of empirical research that shows it's no longer that U-shaped relationship between happiness and age. And in fact, roughly since 2013, and probably the rise of social media being the cause, there's been a huge increase in pretty much every measure of life dissatisfaction amongst young people, perhaps due maybe in part to other factors, maybe COVID, for example, but largely to social media. And so I think the lesson that you can perhaps take away from that is in the same way that people's relationship with social media probably has a very tangible effect on your own mental health and your own life and your own relationships, AI probably will have some effect, whatever it might end up being, on you, yourself, your own approach to life, your own studying, your own happiness, your own mental health, etc. And we might not know what that relationship is, like the relationship between AI and happiness or the relationship between AI and worker productivity. We might not know what that is for 10, 15, 20 years. A lot of this will probably just be based on empirical data. So I think it probably is useful at the individual level to just consciously check how you are personally using AI, what questions you are personally asking to ChatGPT. This sounds like very philosophical life advice. I don't mean it in like and the supreme God of the world who knows what is objectively best for you. I suppose I just mean it more in the very banal sense of like AI is an enormously powerful technology. And if the last 20 years have taught the world, not just me, but the world anything, it's probably that very powerful technologies can be very good in some ways and very destructive in others. And being cognizant of that is useful. And then the other thing I think is like people should just like pay attention to these things. I think it's easy-ish to just like think about things like AI somewhat passively, like, oh, ChatGPT has come out with a new update, or Claude has released a new version, or this new feature is now available. Let me try it out. Let me experiment with it, etc. I think there's a lot of value in thinking pretty critically about the ethics of AI and about the potential security risks of AI or what AI might do if it's implemented en masse. Not because you're going to stop AI from destroying the world or because you're going to make sure AI isn't racist, but because technologies with huge power and beneficial and destructive power are things that people should think about fairly critically and should be skeptical of. This, to some extent, is the 2024 World's Finals topic, ironically. The topic is basically whether we should prefer the natural to the artificial. And perhaps one of the reasons to prefer the natural to the artificial, as was argued by the winning team in the 2024 finals, is there is a benefit to being skeptical about new technologies and thinking cautiously about what their implications might be. And I think that probably is true today with AI. So that's a very philosophical answer, but hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, no, I think yeah, it's kind of very interesting generative AI, especially also it's biotech, correct? That's also one area which can transcend much more deeply us, correct? What we are as a humans, correct? So yeah, Pranay, you have a question?
I have a question, and I think it's more about the fact that you've not had a debate coach. And I would love to know what is your sort of self-teaching regiment that you have, which has caused you to have such high levels of success. And I'm sure it will help debaters worldwide because I think I know your answer will start with self-awareness theoretically. I think that's where it starts, knowing where you are currently, knowing where you want to go. But, how specifically do you really have that routine set? How do you look at your debates, things like that?
Yeah, so I will preface this with one meta comment, then I'll actually answer the question, which is, so I haven't had an actual debate coach in university. At the same time, I don't think it would be fair to portray myself as like the woe is me, very disadvantaged debater down on my luck who got lucky. I am enormously privileged in just about every possible imaginable axis. I am a cis white male at an Ivy League school in the United States with copious funding for our debate society. Like I lucked out on just about every imaginable axis, and there are people who have way, way less privilege on just about every possible metric than I do. So this is not me attempting to be like, well, if I can do it, then anyone can do it sort of thing. Like there are lots of other factors that come into play here. So I think my advice on approaching debate without a sort of formal coach or without an official mentor of sorts is two things. So the first thing is you need this is going to sound a little weird, and it is related to self-awareness, but you need to figure out why you like debate and like what it is that brings you joy in the activity. And I don't mean this just generically to be sappy. I mean it specifically because the biggest barrier, in my opinion, to getting good at debate is just not having the energy to improve and not having the energy to push yourself to become better, to do practice rounds, to matter file, to do tournaments, etc. And if the big barrier, because ultimately the reason a coach is useful is because it just makes you improve faster. In other words, what a coach does for you is they give you advice, they give you resources, they give you feedback. And in doing so, that means that rather than doing 10 practice rounds to improve your average speaker score by a point, you only need to do 5, let's say. I'm making numbers up here. So the benefit of a coach is they allow you to improve, at least in theory, at a faster rate. But ultimately, the limiting factor that determines how good you can be at debate is the extent to which you can invest time into improving or into learning or into getting better. And to that extent, whether you do or do not have a coach, the thing that you need to figure out above all else, at least in my view, is how can I willingly and voluntarily convince myself that spending time on this thing we call debate is worthwhile. Why is it worth my time on a random Thursday night to spend an hour watching a debate video when I could do something else? And to that extent, in order to figure out why, I guess the way I'll put it is this. If you can figure out what it is that you like about debate, that is how you should then prep. So for me, the thing I like about debate is I think it's really interesting to talk about complicated issues in the world. I don't much care for the strategic aspects. I think it's kind of interesting to talk about meta debate strategy, but I'm not super thrilled about that. I'm not that interested in doing debate for the sake of winning. Winning is cool, but it's not the reason I do it. The reason I do debate is because I think it's interesting to talk about interesting things with interesting people in interesting contexts. So to that extent, my debate prep focuses almost exclusively on that. I've probably done fewer than 5 practice rounds in the last 2 calendar years. Like I don't do that many practice rounds. It's not my style of prep. My style of prep is almost entirely based on knowledge accumulation and thinking about how that applies to debates. And the reason that works for me is because that's the thing I like about debate. And so if I'm trying to convince myself at 8 p.m. on a Thursday to spend an hour watching a debate round, the way I justify that to myself, or the reason I'm excited to do that, is because that's what brings me meaning in the activity. The reason I mention this whole what brings you joy in the activity is if you're going to improve without a coach, the biggest barrier that you're probably going to, or one of the biggest barriers, maybe not the, is just not being able to have the drive or have the will to go the extra mile to improve or to do rounds or to do tournaments. And the way that you get past that is by figuring out what it is that you like so that you can tailor your prep regimen around that. Not all debaters should prep in the same way, and the way that you should prep should be driven in part by what it is that you want to get out of debate. If the thing you want to get out of debate is to think about debate as like a chess game, like I really like the strategic aspects of debate, then the way that you prep for debate should look nothing like the way I prep for debate. You probably shouldn't spend all that much time abstractly reading, academic papers about economic theory. You should spend a lot of time thinking about strategy and doing weighing drills and doing practice rounds on weird, quirky topics that make you think about the strategic choices you're making. If the thing that brings you joy in debate is the friends that you have, you should not prep based on my strategy of just like locking yourself in the library for 8 hours and reading books. You should do a lot of time like doing practice rounds or doing drills with your partners, because if the relationships are the thing that bring you joy in debate, that's what you should focus on. So I think that if you don't have a coach, the thing that you should remember is having a coach is not a cheat code to getting good at debate. It's just a way of getting good at debate faster. So the way you can make up for that is by having the organic will inside you to be like, yeah, I am willing to spend 20 or 30% more effort than someone else to get better at this activity. And the way you do that is by figuring out what you want to get out of debate, to align what you want to get out of debate with how you're prepping. Second piece of advice on improving without a coach is there are just a ridiculous number of online resources, almost to the extent it's counterproductive, in the sense that there are like way too many videos on way too many. I don't mean this in a mean or derogatory way, but there are way too many videos than any person could ever possibly watch. I mean, even the matter files I've released, like it's almost objectively useless to just spend your time reading the 1,000-ish pages of notes that I've released publicly. There are so many online resources out there. But I think that it's hugely advantageous to be a non-coached debater today as opposed to in the past, because there are so many excellent, wonderful debaters who have done so much to produce resources for others that you can learn from, even if you don't have an official coach yourself. The biggest problem is figuring out what resources to use, right? Like if you, I don't know, went on YouTube and Googled or searched up debate economics lecture, you will probably get 30. You'll probably get, I have one, there are a bunch of debaters who have economics lectures out there. There are a bunch. And one of the big issues is figuring out like which lecture do I watch? If I want to get better at economics, which lecture do I watch? I think what you should mostly just do is find a series of debaters or lecturers or YouTube channels or whatever it happens to be that speak in a way that you like, or explain concepts in a way that you like, or talk about things that are interesting to you, and just follow them. Like if, for example, I'll be biased for a moment here, and like I think that I have some fairly entertaining YouTube lectures out there on like miscellaneous topics. If you want to hear me make some really, really bad dad jokes for 2 hours, like I've got you. Like that, I got your bases covered on that. If you want to watch, for example, just like, an hour-long lecture on philosophy, Dylan McCarthy, for example, has one of the best lectures I've ever seen on how to deal with the state power principle in debate that they've uploaded on their YouTube channel. Go watch that and just get something out of that, and then watch their other videos because they're great. So I suppose the point of I'm saying is, not having a coach doesn't mean you don't have resources. The problem is there are too many resources. And so rather than feeling overwhelmed because you need to watch all of them or watch all those lectures or read all of those notes, pick a few that you think align with your whatever you want to get out of debate, and watch and read and digest those. And you won't necessarily watch every YouTube lecture ever given about debate, but you'll get close to knowing everything you need to know about debate, even if you don't have a coach yourself.
Yeah, interesting. I think a couple of questions related to it, but I will just summarize one. So I think you talk about chess. So we talk about AI in general in the past. So look at how AI in the chess has evolved, correct? So I think AI in chess is the first experimentative of AI, or whatever you call it, like machine learning is a whole sort of umbrella, correct? Which applies actually in gaming or real world application. And for the last 30 years, it was just there. But now here is a stage, and especially after the DeepMind model, I guess 10 years, 15 years back, where it created the very creative moves, correct? As compared to what human could potentially think. Obviously, in the human language, it's still far from, but I believe it could be possible. And obviously, I don't know how people will stay with this idea that people, such a persuasive argument that the AI is able to create, which is very much nuanced, not what is like hallucinated and all of this, but that could be very much feasible in the future. And there, see how the debating works with that will be interesting, because now people have taken that idea that you can debate with AI, but still most of the debating or the chess happens with human, man to man, like a human to human, correct, that kind of idea. Now, last question from my side, and we are running late, is that what's your next after college, correct? What your ideal world look like? Do you have a job that you are considering? I believe a lot of a student or general student across the world look at consultant or finance jobs as most lucrative, or you are looking at something else. What's the take, and how you're gonna bring your curiosity of world affairs, political science into that, and into especially the international relationship, how the security and all will work. So what your future job work look like?
So I definitely won't be consulting or finance, but I'll likely end up either doing some variant of grad school potentially, probably something international relations related, or I'll end up working for some sort of research type group. So some think tank or NGO will probably be the path I end up pursuing. I admittedly still need to figure out the exact details on that, but something along those lines.
Okay, just last, sorry, Pranay, it was the last question, but before that, even one more last question. So look, I don't know. If you don't want to answer, it's fine, correct? It's pretty much fine, because it's like a bit political, correct? So what is happening around the world? You are a good debater, you understand the world, but tell me, like, how you thinking that what Trump is doing in general, how they're going to pan out, correct? Is there a similarity somewhere in the world? Or, we don't really know, like, how does it going to pan out? You're going to be more secure world because ultimately he's able to bring a deal with Ukraine, correct? I don't know how much will it sustain? Will it be able to stop Russia for long? Is it like a long-term peace deal? Is just a short-term thing? What happened in Israel? So what's your take, like how the Trumpism gonna span in the future, not like immediate, which obviously hard, like, when you look at multiple things, it's difficult to predict short term, especially if you look at stock market and all, but long term, you can look at the potential trajectory that can follow. So what you believe in those trajectories that could potentially we can go?
So I am very confident this will work out disastrously. And what I mean is I think that what Trump is doing domestically for the US economy, and more importantly, perhaps for the set of democratic institutions in the United States, will pan out rather poorly for the US domestically. Internationally, I think the consequences will probably be much worse than whatever Trump does to the United States. There are already small examples of this. Probably the most obvious at a tangible level is gutting humanitarian aid programs, which have already caused probably people to die that otherwise wouldn't have died under the Trump administration. But I do think that in terms of the security question, this is so I think a lot about international security. I think it's an interesting and scary but important field to think about. And I think the typical argument that Trump makes for why, or Trump fans make for why Trump's approach to foreign policy will yield security in the long run is some sort of conception of strength or peace through strength, i.e., if you sort of project muscle and power and American hegemony, then other countries will fall in line. Russia will agree to a peace deal in Ukraine. Israel will agree to a peace deal with Gaza / with Hezbollah, and you'll sort of avoid conflict. I think there are two problems here. Well, there are many problems, I lied, but I'll just highlight two. The first and perhaps the most important is that part of whether you think the United States is the greatest thing since sliced bread, or whether you think the United States is an evil neo-colonial imperial power, the one thing that you can probably agree on is that the United States acting exclusively with a focus on isolationism or self-interest means that the world doesn't get safer. It just means that the United States retreats from it. And the long-term consequence of that is a significant opportunity for power grab, for conflict, for violence. So the simplest example of this probably would be East Asia. So probably the main concern that many people have with Trump today is if Trump continues to abandon many US allies, think NATO, think Ukraine, what's to stop, say, a country like North Korea from believing that South Korea could be vulnerable to some sort of offensive operation if the United States won't stand by its security commitments? What's to stop China, for example, from viewing Taiwan as a potential flashpoint where the United States would no longer commit to defending itself? Even in the context of Ukraine-Russia, it's hard to envision why a peace deal that Putin agrees to works long-term if the United States isn't willing to give Ukraine some kind of security guarantee. Because if you're Ukraine, what you've seen happen at this point in time is independence from Russia. The Soviet Union collapses, then independence. Then Ukraine forfeits its nuclear weapons in 1994. Then 2014, Crimea is annexed. There's the war in the Donbass. 2022, you get invaded. Maybe you get a peace deal, but there's no clear reason why, if you're Ukraine, you have any reason to believe that peace deal holds into the long term, especially if the country that formerly backed Ukraine's military, i.e. the United States and to some extent Europe, is no longer willing to do that in the future. So maybe you get temporary peace at best. Maybe you get temporary calming of conflicts. But it seems unlikely that those last long term if the United States increasingly retreats from its position on the global stage. And this argument doesn't require you to believe the United States is good. I think that that's something that's a little funky about this. The argument I'm making is a realist argument about the existence of a global power, not necessarily that global power being good, but the idea is that even if the United States is a deeply immoral or evil or problematic actor, the retreat of that actor from the international sphere will nonetheless create more instability, even if the United States has horribly misbehaved in the past. The second other reason for this, though, is that the United States itself probably faces an increasingly unstable future long term. It's a little odd outside of the United States, perhaps, to understand like just the specific ways in which Trump is eroding American democracy, because some of them are somewhat technical. Like some of them are a little bit hard to concretize. But I think that if you just look at what Trump has done, particularly with respect to undermining judicial institutions in the United States, calling for the impeachment of judges, ignoring court orders with respect to illegal deportations, actively interfering with agencies that are directly run and controlled by Congress, not the White House. They're all examples of ways in which the second Trump term seems to be significantly more radical in its sort of approach to executive power than the first Trump term. And I think the concern there is even if you think that the United States could theoretically project peace through a sort of Trumpian conception of power, the problem is that the long-term trajectory of American democracy looks increasingly authoritarian. I'm skeptical of like fear-mongering about, like, oh, the United States becomes like a tyrannical dictatorship under Trump, et cetera. You don't need to believe that. But I think it is indisputable that the direction of the United States under Trump is towards democratic backsliding, particularly towards eroding the powers of the legislative and judicial branches relative to the executive branch under Trump. The reason that's relevant for international security is the biggest threats that the United States poses to other countries, think the invasion of Iraq, for example, is what happens when the United States can act unilaterally. In other words, the thing that causes international instability, I think to a substantial extent, is when a small number of people operating with incomplete information or cognitive groupthink act in ways that they think are right that almost everyone else thinks are bad. Putin invading Ukraine is an obvious example. Bush convincing the United States to go into Iraq in 2003 is another. And the concern is that as the United States increasingly centralizes power around one faction of the government, namely the White House and the cult of personality around Trump, because Republicans in the House and the Senate are unwilling to sort of push back against executive overreach, and the judiciary is increasingly under attack and increasingly losing its political influence, the consequence is that more and more of the machinery of the American government are consolidated in their control by a smaller and smaller number of people. And the reason I think that's concerning is if you want to avoid a war in Taiwan, or if you want to avoid long-term strife in Ukraine, or if you want to ensure that countries like South Korea and Japan and Poland don't feel a need to acquire nuclear weapons, or if you don't want the United States to randomly invade countries like Greenland or Panama, the way you do that is by having some multi-factional government in Washington, where you have multiple branches of government with competing interests and competing aims and competing information that mean that the United States is relatively stable in its foreign policy and stable in its commitment to its allies and stable in its views on the world. The more and more that power is consolidated into one branch of the government, the less and less likely it is that the United States exhibits stability in its international behavior. And already you're seeing that with Trump, the repeated imposition and then walking back of tariffs is probably a pretty obvious example. But I think the long-term outcome here is strictly negative for the United States and more importantly, probably for the world writ large.
Over to you, and then from my thanks, Ryan. Thanks a lot for taking questions. Yeah.
Perfect. I think my last question for you today, it's more of a fun one. I was thinking about what to ask you, right? I usually sort of go with something like, if you had to describe your debating journey in a song or a movie, what would it be? But for you, I have realized that you have a specific love for words and putting words together that I have not seen as much. I mean, it's a big thing to say for debaters, right? But I'm probably going to give you a humongous Herculean task, which is if you have to describe your debating journey in one word, what word would that be?
Interesting. Let me think what word I'd have to go with. This is a good one. Let me puzzle for a second. What word I would say best describes it. So I think I'll give two answers. One is like a fair answer, and one is like the crazy answer. I'll start with the crazy answer. So one of my favorite words in the English language, and I don't think that, admittedly, many languages don't have like a one word for this, but defenestration is one of, I think, the funniest words in the English language. To defenestrate means to throw out a window. So there is literally a verb in English that means to throw something or someone out a window. I think to some extent, maybe this is like a really weird good way of metaphorically capturing my debate career. But I do think to some extent, I don't know why, I just think that like to at least some extent, I probably have pursued a somewhat unusual approach to improving a debate relative to the typical path, just in the sense that I probably don't do things that many other debaters do that make them good. So perhaps to some extent, I'll say I sort of defenestrate some conventional wisdom with respect to debate improvement, although that's probably a bit of a far-fetched analogy that maybe isn't perfect. But I'll plug the word defenestrate anyway, because I think it's rather fun. I think the second word that I would probably use to describe, and this one's actually maybe, I guess it's not that much weirder, is sophomore. So sophomore is the word that most Americans use for like the second year in college and in school, whatever. And I think it's kind of like a fun way of capturing sort of my debate career. So I forget exactly what the particular etymology of sophomore is, but if you look at like what sophomore means, like if you break down its actual word components, it basically means at its core like wise idiot. The idea being that a sophomore, like a second year in school, thinks they know everything because they have finished their first year and therefore no longer a stupid fresher. But they still are actually quite an idiot. I think to some extent, this is how I would describe my own approach to debate, by which I mean, at many points in my debate career, I thought I was quite good, or I thought I was at least working quite well as a debater. And then 6 months would go by, a year would go by, I would look back and I would say, actually, that was fake news. This was not peak debating. There are many flaws here. Even today, like I'll look back at my world speeches and say, there are parts here that I would change, or this particular mechanism is a bit lacking. And so I think to some extent, at least for me, my debate career has sort of been defined to a substantial extent by improvement, and then recognizing that where I previously thought I had improved to actually still had quite a lot of ways to go. So that's probably the word I'd go with as a perhaps different metaphor.
I love both of those, especially being a wise idiot. I hope all of us continue to be wise idiots, because
Yes,
otherwise,
I agree with that.
back and seeing where you could have improved, I think it's pointless. So thank you so much for coming on, Ryan. It has been a wonderful conversation. I've sat back, learned a lot in the last 1.5, 2 hours, right? And I think there's a lot more I can learn from you. So hopefully, I'm going to watch through all of your videos again and see what I can do to apply into my own debating journey. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.